Hello there, and welcome to Podtalk. I'm Melanie Potushnik, and I'm glad you've tuned in. I'm joined here with four others who, for the next 20 minutes, will be talking about how the Bible talks and explains generosity, propels us to abundance, and to live a life that really is life. In Pod Talk, we'll listen in on the conversations of those who have been at that work, both in their individual lives and within their communities. First, a few introductions. Bob Davis hails from Iowa, and he's been involved in pastoral work for a very long time. He's semi-retired, is involved in many community organizations, and has lots of interesting hobbies. He and his wife, Nancy, have 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Bob. Peter Halstead is a retired pastor who has designed and led many leadership conferences on abundance in the metropolitan Chicago area. He enjoys helping people discover God's abundant gifts in their lives. Peter and his wife Cheryl, grandparent, what I hear is a very spirited 2-year-old. Stefan Potushnik grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, where there he was schooled also for pastoral ministry. He has been overtaken by the examples of God's abundance through the food pantry here that was begun during the pandemic at Christus Victor. Stefan and I serve together as pastors and in cooperation here with our 4 teenage boys. Pam Rodriguez is a woman of faith who puts her faith into action daily. She's retired from a career in human services, and so many people ask her what brought her to this work, and she always says, my faith. Specifically, Matthew 25. I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me. Pam is a mother of 2 and a grandmother for 5. So that's us. But we want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories. And there's a place where you can submit them at cvlutheran.org/generoushearts. So go there. We want to hear how God's abundance has touched your heart and how you're living out your generosity stories in the places where you live, work, and play. So are we ready?
Yes.
Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. In this text, the Apostle Paul is talking about what true koinonia is about. Christian koinonia, community, sharing, intimacy with God and with one another. It perhaps is not only about sharing in one another's joys and sorrows, but could we challenge ourselves with thinking about how it could be sharing in one another's poverty and wealth? At this time, I freely share with you because I have abundance, and then maybe at some other point in time when I lack, then you share with me. Christian koinonia is grounded in God's grace. So, as a part of the podcast, we're going to have a first comment. So we'll get all the creative juices flowing and we'll get some great questions going. And so first comment today, Peter, take it away.
Well, when I volunteered to do the first comment for the first episode, I didn't know you were going to start with koinonia. That's an unfamiliar word to a lot of us, but I think it's a good one, and I think it's going to get us a long way. But for right now, if you have a Bible, you don't need it open at the moment, just set it aside. We're going to take a look at some basic thoughts. Koinonia, of course, means community. It means sharing. I say it means we're in this together. It's about being in it together. And so as far as generosity goes, generosity is something that we do together. Sometimes we do it individually, but the big picture is generosity is something that God makes happen in this world by creating koinonia, creating that joining together and sharing. Couple of things I'd like to say about generosity just to get us started. Generosity, first of all, is more than just giving stuff away. It's more than giving stuff away. You and I, we all know people who we consider to be generous people. And in my world, those are some of the people that I admire the most. Not because they necessarily have a lot of money. Sometimes they don't have very much at all. But they are the kind of people that will be generous in many aspects of their lives. They might say, well, we're going to go out on Friday night. Can we come by and pick you up? They are just always thinking of how they are going to share whatever they have, whether it be money or time or energy or whatever it is that God has gifted them with. So generosity is about your character. It's about generosity of spirit, as we'll hear us say. But the other thing about generosity is I really believe it involves a sense of freedom. It's about being able to rejoice in the abundance of the gifts that God has put into this world. God's creation is overflowing with abundant gifts. And so we rejoice in that. And I know sometimes I will give a specific gift. I might write a check to charity. And then I have to be a little careful sometimes because I'll find myself patting myself on the back and thinking of what a nice thing that I did. And surely it was a good thing. But I also don't want to get to the point where I'm thinking, I let go of some of my things. The rest now I'm going to hold on to pretty tightly for a while because I just don't know. I might not have enough myself. So we'll come back to that, but I just want to toss that out for the groups that are going to be discussing the topic of generosity and abundance. So 2 Corinthians 8, the passage that we've laid out, Paul is talking about koinonia and specifically about generosity. First of all, he talks about the believers in Macedonia. Up north, those Macedonians, it seems, have just exploded with generosity. Paul says, it exceeded all of my expectations. Paul says, in the middle of a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. He can't get over it. He said, if I hadn't been there and seen it for myself, I wouldn't have believed it. They literally begged us. He's going way over the top. They literally begged us for the privilege of sharing. And the sharing was going to go to the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. And then he turns to his Corinthian friends that he's writing to. He says, you need to be in on this too. You started a year ago. Now it's time to finish it up. Take your part. Excel in this. God has provided abundantly for you. But give what you have. We're not expecting you to give what you don't have. He says, I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you. But maybe someday, when you're in deep need, they will, out of their abundance, share what they have with you. So koinonia, Jerusalem, Macedonians, Corinthians, they are all in it together. Well, I'll let my friends here jump in wherever they would like to, and I hope we can get a discussion started.
Sure, I would like to jump in right away. Thanks, Peter, for the introduction to this text and to Paul. Paul was really intrigued early on when he opened his heart for God and when he had this Damascus experience that he realized he needs to share the gospel and to other people, not just in Jerusalem where the gospel was first shared and where the first community was built. So he traveled, and he always traveled and shared community. He always shared generosity because he experienced a generous grace from God. And he said, it's all about grace. It's all about sharing. And he shared with them that the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem were struggling to make it. And he knew there was a big split, you can say, between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. The Jewish Christian in Jerusalem didn't feel like they were the same and you had to be first a Jewish Christian, and so there was this, not acceptance, but for Paul it was all about how we invite other people to the table, how we can build a community where everyone is a part of. So when he came back to Jerusalem, he brought a large offering from the Macedonian, from the Corinthian congregation he started, and he overwhelmed them with love, with giving. And then the conversation started. So maybe they love Jesus too. Maybe we are all the same and all brothers and sisters. So generosity and giving creates something in us that usually opens our hands and invites others, and which is really powerful. So I'm wondering how you experience generosity and what your thoughts are inviting others and opening others, inviting them to the table. So see what others think.
So I'm the only non-pastor at the table, you may have noticed. And so I'm not going to try to talk about Macedonia and Damascus and, all of that. But what I'm thinking of as I listen to both of you talk and as I prepared today is that generosity is something we learn. Paul was teaching people by by giving examples of what it's like to be generous and why we are generous. And we learn that in community, right? And so I think it's important for us to remember when we think about generosity that it's something we grow in. And we often, as humans, start from a place of fear and self-protection and kind of, grasping onto things as if those things are going to give us security. And we're afraid oftentimes of open-handedly, generously giving, sharing, welcoming others to our table, whatever it might be, because then I might have less and I might be eventually without. And so I think when I think about growing in generosity, I think about a continuum from like fear to trust in God, and from, this scarcity and grasping tightly to things that I want to hang on to that give me a sense of security, to living abundantly, openly, generously sharing whatever I have to give.
Freedom.
And I think that it's important to recognize that generosity isn't just about money. I think you said that. It's not about just our financial contributions, but it is about giving time. It is about volunteering our service. It is about being hospitable and welcoming to strangers, to new people, to people in need. And so when I think about learning to be generous in community, I think that it is a journey for us, and it's a journey from fear to faith and trust in God.
I think sometimes we need to state the obvious, right? And the obvious here in Corinthians and for Paul, it is all about the relationships.
Yeah.
And when you think about our faith, it's about the relationship too. The relationship that we try to live into in a covenant with God, who says, what I want for you is to have abundance in your life and to have a sense of joy, contentment, peace, to practice this kind of love. I think, Peter, part of that passage too, I picked up on that phrase of sincerity of love. Mm-hmm. And it seems that Paul's kind of saying there is an authentic way of loving one another, a genuine way of loving one another. And as you were talking, Pam, you start thinking about the people in our lives. Where do we learn this from? And I think it's great to have the scripture. That's that ancient tradition, to spark some ideas. But I would encourage everyone as well to start thinking about maybe the people in your life that have been a part of you learning, as you're saying, Pam, to help us to grow. I think of the Old Testament, I was mentioning before, we started here, but Solomon, when he prayed, he didn't pray for wealth or a long life. He prayed for a discerning heart. And I've often held on to that, and I think, what does it mean? And it seems that I think Solomon was trying to say it takes effort, takes intentionality to be a person of faith. And Paul's saying that as well. And I think he takes his cues from Jesus, who says, there's one thing I need you to do. You love one another. And so the sincerity of love that Paul is talking about that motivates them in the first place is the kind of love that comes from the inside. And then generosity, Peter, like you were saying, becomes more of an external expression. I think, and I put some flesh on it, I think of a woman that I got to know on my very first call. Ella Nathan was her name. She lived to be 106. She was born 8 years after the end of the Civil War, so just to put things in perspective. So at the end of the 19th century, all the way through the 20th century, she lived with her daughter, Pearl, who was in her 80s. And Ella, she had this wonderful spirit of gratitude in her life. And she told me whenever I would see her take her communion about how grateful she was. And, you know, it isn't that there weren't trials and struggles. She had buried her husband. She had buried all of her children except for Pearl. She had buried grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So God knows that she had a lot of reasons to look at life in a different way. But this was a person that got up every day and said that, you know, she was grateful for the day and the abundance of that day. And I think about someone like her and how she then practiced that generosity. And she would write a letter once a week to someone she knew. You know, that's generosity of spirit. My grandma, she used to say to me, say thank you. And I always thought she was trying to say, have good manners. But really what it came down to was she was trying to say, live a life of gratitude. And then I looked, she used to feed people. They lived out in the country near a railroad. And when people would travel, you know, the homeless would travel by the rails, they would put a sign on sometimes along the route that would say, here's a place you could get food. My grandpa worked construction, and he was gone during the week. And there would be strangers, total strangers, that would come to her home, and she would always feed them and make sure they always had something to eat. And they struggled, and to be able to do that. My parents always had, I didn't know this is what you called it, it's just that we always had an open chair at our table. We could always bring anybody home that we wanted to. There was always plenty to go around. It didn't matter. I mean, we had certain, if there's company, don't, make sure everybody gets, that part of it. But you know what? We never went hungry, to be able to do that and stuff. So I do think there are things like this that we start. I would encourage people to think about the people in their lives that maybe have taught them something. And the only other thing I would say, I remember reading a piece one time that said there are 3 things that we need to learn how to say before we die. The first one is thank you. The second one is I'm sorry, which is forgiveness and forgiving. And the third one is I love you. And I've often thought about that. And Melanie, like you were saying, this is about us living that life to the fullest. And, to think about it and how generosity is a way that we can live into that as well. So.
The beautiful thing is when we experience generosity, it is contagious. It does something in us. It is not negative. It is positive. It is hopeful. It gives us energy. And when I hear generosity stories, it's like a sponge. I want to hear more. And they inspire me to live generous in whatever gifts I received. And sometimes we learn it from children. I was told the story happened 2 weeks ago here, right behind these walls. A family walks in, first time from Ukraine, a young family. I met them today in person, the family. And they walked in and had a 6-year-old boy, and he picked up English quite fast, and they received their food in a shopping cart. And then the boy looks up and says in perfect English, "We came with 0, and look what we have now." And he opened his hand over the shopping cart. And everybody around knew what he was saying. He came with 0, and now he was receiving toys, food, and he felt so good that he said it in English. It's not his mother tongue. He just learned it a few weeks ago to say these words. What is he teaching us? We come all with 0. None of us came with a lot. It was 0. And God continues to bless us and gives us. And we think if we keep it, we have a good life. The boy is teaching us if we share it, we have a better life. And that's what I want to do here, and I'm super excited about this conversation, and I hope it will inspire the listeners and all of us to think about where we can share and give and be generous, and then share what it does in us.
Thank you for all of your comments and your expertise and your understanding of the word. I think that, sort of a tie-in is they begged for more sharing. That is the hope involved, so that when we live a life of generosity and when we're taken in our hearts by that love, then we want to beg for more opportunities to give it all away, right? That's a different way of living. So thank you so much for all of your wisdom and understanding. And if you're listening to this podcast on your own, you may access the reflection questions at cvlutheran.org/generoushearts. And if you are listening with your missional communities, have at those questions, tackle them, have some fun. If you still would like to join a missional community, you can also go to that same page and join. It's not too late at this time. Share the Pod Talk with a friend on your way to Starbucks with your questions. You can listen to the Pod Talk and then discuss it over coffee. But let's get started on our generosity journey that will change this world. We'll see you next time on Pod Talk.